And that there are several father-themed verses in the Gita. I thought I would select one of them and then lecture on that. Any guesses as to which one I picked? Your ability to answer the question depends on you having a somewhat comprehensive knowledge of the verses of the Gita, because you'd have to be able to pick a theme, fatherhood, and then think of the verses of the Gita which would be appropriate. So it's an intermediate level question. You could prove how learned you are by even coming up with any answer to the question. All right, that's a pretty obvious one. Krishna literally says, "I'm the father of the universe." Pitaham asya jagato. Pita means father. Pitaham, I am the father. Asya, of this. Jagataha, of this world, of this universe. That's an obvious one. It's not the one I picked, but that's a pretty obvious one. There's another one where Krishna says, Tasmin garbam dadam yaham, in that womb of material nature, I place the seed. This is Krishna using a sexual metaphor to describe the creation of the universe, where he's both the womb, mama yoni, my womb, garbam dadam yaham, I place the seed into my womb, and so he takes on both roles, both the masculine and feminine roles in the creation of the universe, using a sexual metaphor. That I didn't pick that one either. I think those are two, just off the top of my head, likely candidates if you had to speak about fatherhood, because they literally describe fatherhood. He's doing okay. He's doing all right. He's doing pretty good. Let's just let him make a little noise. That's all right. I didn't pick either one of those. I picked what I think is a little bit of an out-of-the-box verse. So I'm gonna give you guys the verse and go through it with you so that you own the verse. I'm gonna go through it with you in detail so that the verse becomes yours and you know what it says, literally and also contextually. And then I want to see if you guys can fit together why I might have selected this verse as a verse on fatherhood. Here's the verse. Ananyas chintayanto mam ye jana paryupasate. Paryupasate. Ye jana paryupasate. Those people who worship me. Ye, who, janaha, people, paryupasate, they worship me completely. Upasate means worship. Paryupasate means they worship me completely. Pari means around. Like parikrama, when you circumambulate something. So you have the word ambulate, means walking. You're ambulatory, so you're walking. Pretty sure the word ambulance comes from ambulatory. Ambulance, I'm pretty sure it must be there. And then walking around, so that's pari in Sanskrit. So parikrama, when you walk around something, it's a standard Hindu ritual that you walk around a sacred item or object or temple. Oftentimes temples will be built where, if the temple's a very, very large structure, they'll have a little walkway that goes around the altar so that pilgrims can walk around the temple without necessarily exiting the whole building and walk around the building, which may be impossible to do. There might be a mountain there, but they'll carve, a little walkway around the deity so you can walk around the temple. We have that in Vrindavan, for example. Relatively small walkway behind the altar so you can walk around the deities in Vrindavan. Many temples have it. Ye jana paryupasate. Interestingly enough, other religions do the same thing. So if you look at the Kaaba in Mecca, and the Muslims, when they go on the Hajj and they go to the big temple, it's funny because Muslims oftentimes advertise themselves as being iconoclastic. They destroy deities, and of course they did that in India tremendously. But they also describe that they don't believe in worshiping a deity, but then they bow down to a rock in Mecca 5 times a day religiously. And then they have to go to that rock and walk around that rock, and that's one of their 5 main pillars of their tradition. It's usually what happens is when it's your tradition, it's called an icon or a symbol, and you find a way to describe its meaning and value to your people. And then when it's the object of another tradition that you don't like, then you call it an idol or a fetish. We use the word fetish a lot of times to refer to weird sexual habits, but the word fetish actually originally referred to when you venerate a totem or an object that has no necessary spiritual value, but you think it does. You think it does. And so we find really defamatory language to describe the symbols of another tradition, and then we, in a very careful way, describe the symbols of our own tradition such that their sacredness is not lost when we describe them, and people don't think it's, the cross is a symbol of what Christ did for mankind. And we make sure everybody gets it, how important this thing is. Anyway, so even an iconoclastic tradition like Islam, they end up walking around a rock. And that's a big deal for them, is going there and seeing that, and touching it, and at least touching the building it's housed in. So parikrama. So anyway, this is parupasate, same word, pari, around, like complete, around, like kind of like a full thing. So those people who worship me completely by ananyas chintayantaha mam, by thinking of me and nothing else. Anya means something else. Ananya means nothing else. Exclusively. Chintayantaha mam. They think of me and nothing else. For those people who worship me completely by thinking of me and nothing else, and this is interesting because it defines a complete act of devotion as requiring nothing other than someone's thought. Generally, when you want to define something, you look at its cognitive, its thought component, as well as its behavioral component, the things you do, your actions. Our standard definition for bhakti is devotional service. Devotion is the cognitive aspect, and service is the practical, physical aspect. At least verbal. You chant, at least verbal. This verse, at least the first half of the verse, defines a complete devotional act as consisting merely of thinking. And actually, I think it's important that a tradition has verses like this, because there may be a situation you find yourself in where you're paralyzed, where you're on your last legs, where you got one foot out the door, and the only thing left you can do is to think about Krishna. And that should be a complete act. So, ye jana paryupasate ananyas chintayanto mam. Those people who completely worship me by thinking of me and nothing else. And it's interesting because that and nothing else might seem like an unnecessary add-on, but you can have distracted thought. You can be, now some people think you can do 2 things at once. You can't actually do 2 things at once. What you do is you vacillate between the 2 things you're doing. you can look at a scan of someone's brain while they're thinking of things, and what they're actually doing is they're thinking of one thing, storing it in their short-term memory, thinking of something else, and then going back to the first thing they were thinking about and pulling it from their short-term memory. And you go back and forth really quickly. It uses a lot of glucose. Your brain uses a ton of glucose. And you're going back and forth, but you can't actually think of two things at once. And that's why oftentimes when you're talking to someone who's texting or doing something else, and you say, "Are you listening?" They'll say, "Of course I'm listening. You just said to me," and they'll repeat what you just said to them. But what's actually happening is they are hearing for the first time what you said to them when they repeat it to you. We're all guilty of this. You said, "I was listening to you. You just said to me," and then you say what they said, and at that moment, when you say what they said to you that was being stored, undigested in your short-term memory, at that moment you remember what they said to you. And you jump back quickly, get your hand out of the cookie jar, and say, "No, I was listening to you the whole time." Or I can do two things at once, when you actually can't. But anyway, so this, you're thinking of me and nothing else. And that, it's significant because it means that just because you can reduce a complete act of connection with the deity to merely thinking of divinity, I think we're doing pretty good. You're doing good. As far as I'm concerned, we're doing good. Thank you, though. But I'm happy you guys are here, and this is looking okay. If he gets too far and he starts, I don't know, tearing down the building or... Huh? She, sorry, man. And so if she gets too crazy and starts tearing down the building, then we might have to do something else. But right now, we're good. We're good. And there's also, see, that little separation anxiety. So she's like making sure to check in with mom and dad. Right? She did. She saw that. She picked it up. There are some speakers that just need to be able to hear a pin drop and get super agitated when there's kids around. I'm not one of those speakers. However, if you're a lousy parent and you let your kid just run around and just do crazy stuff and you're completely oblivious to it, I take exception to that because it becomes almost like a public nuisance. But provided you're trying, I have a pretty high threshold. Although the act of devotion is being defined as merely consisting of thought, it's actually a high bar because you have to be able to think of Krishna and nothing else. You have to be exclusively devoted to Krishna in your heart. And that's a pretty high bar. How often is it that things happen where you think of nothing else? And usually when things happen, you think of nothing else. For most people who don't regularly practice meditation in a serious way and go into the gym of the mind and work out significantly, usually what happens when you think of nothing else is when you are in a physically challenging position such that you have to use every single bit of your mental capacity to navigate through that challenging physical situation. I'll give you an example. Oftentimes when powerlifters squat an absolute maximal amount of weight for a single repetition, they will report having an adrenaline dump, thinking of nothing else. Sometimes they artificially create an adrenaline dump by smelling salts. Smelling salts are comprised of, ammonium citrate, ammonium nitrate. And they'll smell it, and they'll freak them out, and then they'll go and lift their weight. And in that moment when they're lifting the weight, they oftentimes, in fact, if you've done it, you can report, you stop hearing any sound, and you stop seeing anything else because it's every last bit of energy you have to survive. Or if you're about to drown, this happens. You become very, very focused. Or if you get into a fight, and you become very focused on exactly the task you're doing and nothing else. Sometimes if you're doing something you love, you get into a state of flow. And you lose track of time. And if you could find a job doing something that you love doing so much that you get into a state of flow regularly, that's a blessing. That's a blessing. Although it's being defined merely as thought, it's still quite a high bar. It's still quite a high bar. Ye jana par upasate. Those who think of me completely. Chintayantamam. Think of me. Ananyas. And nothing else. Tesham, for those people. And this is something that happens in Sanskrit that you don't see as often in English. You have these what are called correlatives, where you'll say ye and tesham. Yesham and tesham. Ye and tesham in this case. And what it means is, for those people who do this, then this happens. And we do that in English with what's conditional conjunction. Like if and then. If you do this, then this will happen. So they have that same thing in Sanskrit. In fact, that's what's occurring here. If you think of me and nothing else, and worship me completely by that simple act, Tesham, then for you, Tesham, Nitya Abhiyuktanam. Nitya Abhiyuktanam. For that person who is yoked towards me always. It's called a Bahuvrihi Samas. I want to give you guys a really serious knowledge. It's a compound word in Sanskrit. It's 3 words put together. Nitya, Abhi, and Yukta. Yukta means yoked. It's the past participle of yoga. Yoga means union, and Yukta means yoked. In fact, the English word yoked comes from the Sanskrit word yoga. So Yukta is directly related to yoga, directly related to yoked. So Yukta, yoga, they even sound alike. So Abhiyukta. Abhiyukta means you're dedicated to. You're yoked to me, but Abhi means turning towards me. The prefix Abhi in front of a word. So you're yoked to me, but you're yoked in a favorable way where you're turning towards me. And that's happening nitya all the time. And so a person who's nitya abhiyukta means a person who is always yoked to divinity by turning towards divinity at every moment. Tesham, for that person. Yogakshemam vahami aham. For that person, aham, I, vahami, I carry. What do I carry? Yogakshema. Yogakshema. This is a very interesting compound in Sanskrit. The first usage of the word yoga in the Sanskrit language in the Rig Veda, the oldest Sanskrit text in the world, that's thousands upon thousands of years old, like as old as Jesus, and then double it. Super old. And so, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And so, the first use of the word yoga in the Sanskrit language means war. It was not used in a spiritual sense. In fact, yukta and abhiyukta also mean war. When you link your chariot to a horse, and the only time you would link your chariot to a horse was if you were going to ride out in the battle. It was the equivalent, the modern day equivalent of gearing up. And so, yoga originally meant war, and it was oftentimes used in a compound with the word kshema, which means maintenance and rest. Yoga can also mean exertion. Kshema can mean rest. But yoga kshema also meant in Sanskrit war and peace. Now this meaning in the Gita works really well because the Gita was spoken on a battlefield. So Krishna will say, I will carry you in times of war and peace. Because Arjuna was just about to ride out in the battle. So this meaning, which is a super old meaning of the term, it's not how the term is used in more recent, let's say classical Sanskrit or modern Sanskrit. It's the way the word was used, kind of in the original Veda. But that meaning works really well. Yoga kshema vaham yaham. I will carry you, Arjuna, in times of war and peace. More standard meanings nowadays for yoga kshema is I will preserve what you have. That's kshema. In fact, the word kshema is used oftentimes for insurance. In the Manu Samhita, for instance, a super old Indian legal text, the word kshema refers to insurance. And so I will preserve what you have and carry what you lack. Meaning I will create a union for you with what you need. I will bring you what you need. That's the yoga. And then kshema, I will look after, protect, and ensure what you already have. Yoga kshema vaham yaham. I will preserve what you have and carry what you lack. Okay, that's the verse. You guys now have the verse. If you were listening and you followed everything and you cognized and kept everything, you now understand this verse at a very, very high level. Ananyas chintayantomam ye jana paryupasate. Those people who completely worship me merely by thinking of me exclusively and nothing else. Tesham nityabhiyuktanam. For those people, it's an if-then. For those people who've done that, for those people who are always turned towards me and yoked to me, yogakshemam baham yaham, I will carry what they lack and preserve what they have. Why would I think of this verse in relationship to fatherhood? That's the question. Yes, Leela.
Showing Krishna as a protector and provider.
Okay. Are mothers not protectors and providers?
They are.
Yes, they are.
All right. Mothers are protectors and providers, right?
Yeah.
So then that would be a reason why the verse was parental. But it would not be a reason why the verse was fatherly. You're going to have to take a stronger stance. But we have to escape parental and we have to designate fatherly, which is tough to do nowadays because most of the time nowadays we reduce the difference between women and men and mothers and fathers. And in fact, society is set up that way. Oftentimes a woman will be a primary earner in the household. Sometimes you'll have a stay-at-home dad. And so the mother and father duties are oftentimes shared equally. So I want this verse to be about fatherhood and not about parenthood. It is to some extent about parenthood, but I'm thinking of this verse specifically in terms of fatherhood. So you're going to have to be a little bit more aggressive in your stance. Because if I can reduce what you said to parental, I'm going to do that. And you're going to have to argue for it being fatherly. Primarily, exclusively, but more. We can go with a preponderance of evidence. You give me 51% fatherly, and I'll accept that. If we can go with clear and convincing evidence, 80%, great. Beyond a reasonable doubt, even better, that's 99 point something. What do you got, Shri?
Men, going with what Leela said, this verse is about fathers specifically because men are protectors more so than women.
Are men protectors more so than women?
No.
Okay?
Equal?
Let's not do that. Come on. You got to be cool, man. Don't start answering every question without raising your hand. You get like, it's like a 2. You're 2 or 3. Then we're starting to have problems. Yes?
Well, to consider the physical difference in man and woman.
What physical difference is there between you and your husband?
Oh.
Rasa? This is Rasa's husband. Stand up, Gore.
Really?
Yeah, really. It's like that. Stand up. Also, Rasa, you stand up too. Both of you, come on. Indulge me. It's Father's Day. I just want you guys to really see what we're talking about here. Okay, thank you. You guys can both sit down.
So, I just think that due to the biological build, the composition of hormones, the way that our body functions, for example, the ability of a man to gain muscles in a natural way without injecting any additional hormones into their body versus a woman trying to do the same thing, I think men are just more equipped to develop muscle weight and therefore be stronger physically. And I'm just talking here about physical. I'm not talking about mentally. Just going physically. I think that naturally our men are stronger and therefore physically more equipped to protect than a woman.
It's great when a woman, an enlightened woman, says this because then I don't look bad. I can just agree with her. Yes. Men specifically, because they do not have breasts the same way women do that are capable of lactation. They don't have the same amount of fatty tissue in their upper body. And as a result, they're able to put on more upper body strength. If you were to look, let's say, for instance, at top power lifters amongst men, they can bench press north of 700 pounds versus women where it's normally around 350, 400 pounds for top power lifters. If you look at the squat, it's considerably less difference. Top female squatters will squat 600, 700 pounds. Men are more north of 1,000, but there's much less of a difference. But specifically with regards to upper body strength, because men don't lactate and therefore don't have the fatty tissue and the breast ducts that women do, they put on considerably more upper body strength than women do. And because we, generally speaking, fight with our hands, a significant increase in upper body strength translates to a significantly increased capacity for violence. And it's a physical difference, no doubt. Men are also taller than women. Men also have longer reaches than women. There's a bunch of physical features above and beyond just simply upper body strength. But it does dispose men to be more capable of violence, just as women are capable of doing something men will never be able to do, no matter what happens with modern science. And what is that? They can't create children, or lactate for that matter. That's pretty cool. Women can create children and then feed them. It's almost miraculous when you think about it. And so women have things that they're better than men at, and men have one thing they're better than women at, and that specific thing is the capacity for violence. Interestingly enough, 99.9% of deaths in the history of the world in war are men. Men are also 94% more likely to die in workplace difficult jobs that you're dying, falling off a pole or whatever it might be. Suicide rates, 78%. That's 3.7 to 1, something like that. 3.8 to 1. Violent crimes, 4 to 1. Drug use, 4 to 1. Prison, 3.5 to 4 to 1. Men to women. The ratios are staggering. Women score higher on empathy than men do. 60%, so about 1.5 times more empathetic than men are. 60-40. And so there are significant differences. And those differences aren't merely physical. Women score higher in verbal skills. Reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Men are better at visual rotational skills, envisioning what an object looks like if it's turned in space. So there are also mental differences as well. Women suffer from neuroticism more than men. Men suffer from autism more than women. 4 to 10 to 1, depending on the type of autism you're talking about. And most of this is linked to testosterone levels, because that is the big distinction between men and women. Prenatal testosterone levels. The default position chromosomally is for every person, every human being, to be female. Women produce 2X chromosomes. 22 of our 23 pairs of chromosomes are non-sexed. 1 pair of the 23 pairs of chromosomes are sexed. Men will automatically produce 1 X chromosome. They might produce another chromosome, which is X or Y. So 1/46 of our DNA is where that distinction takes place. Women always produce a double X chromosome. Men produce either double X or XY. If they produce XY, then a male child is born. And when that happens, massive amounts of testosterone are produced. And that results in the female sex organs becoming externalized as male sex organs. I mean, the change in a child's basic anatomy as a result of the increase in sex hormones is so unbelievable. It creates a difference in the sexes. Men score way higher on aggression than women do. They suffer from psychoticism at 3 to 4 times the rate that women do. And so some of these differences you can chalk up to social pressures, like eating disorders are more prominent among women. You could easily reduce that to being the way we structure society. But a number of these are AUSDs, apparent universal sex differences. You find them in, you can look at rhesus monkeys, and if you give rhesus monkeys toys to play with, men play with the wheel toys, the machine toys, and girls play with the plush animal toys. If you raise macaques, they're the kind of monkey, the ones that we have in India that you normally see like in Vrindavan. Macaques have a very similar social structure to human beings, actually. Extremely complicated social structure. You can watch their society going on in front of you in India. It's wild. And if you raise macaques in isolation, female macaques at the age of 2 weeks will start to look at faces and study faces and engage in what's called affiliative behavior, where they try to bond with people. Men don't do that. With an increase in testosterone, there's a massive rightward shift in your thinking, and your thinking occurs in the right hemisphere of your brain, which is linked much more to logic and action, and it's much less creative, and it's much less empathetic. You find these distinctions within animals raised in isolation. They even studied men and women, boys and girls, children, within 24 hours of being born. And they would put a face in front of the children, and they would also put a mobile, that's like a hanging toy thing, of machines. The men looked at the machines, and the girl babies looked at the mobiles. Simon Baron-Cohen, who's in charge of the Autism Research Institute for Cambridge University, did this experiment. Within 1 day of being born. And the more testosterone there was in your amniotic fluid, because they can test that kind of stuff, the longer you'd look at the machine for. Indicating that the more testosterone that was there prenatally, the more a child would be interested in systemizing versus empathizing. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't going to be taller women married to smaller men. I mean, the difference between Rasa and Gore is, how tall are you? And what are you, 6'7"? Yes, it's like a full foot difference. It's an impressive difference. I mean, I could not have picked a better couple to use as examples to validate what I want to talk about. And so you guys did so perfectly. But there are, sometimes you meet women who are taller than men, and they're married to men who are taller, and sometimes sisters are bigger than their brothers, and sometimes you get a really good female power lifter. She'll be able to outlift all of us, including on bench press, no question. But when we look society-wide, when we look at, human beings across the world, you can't get around this stuff. They're AUSDs. They studied this. They looked at 18,000 studies. And they would only accept a universal sex difference if it was in at least 10 studies, and there had never been a study showing no difference or the reverse difference. You follow? 18,000 studies, and to make it onto the list, they came up with 65 of them, to make it onto the list, and the lists they're not just physical differences, they're also mental differences as well, and behavioral differences as well. Here's a crazy one. Men and women both engage in short-term mating strategies, non-marriage, non-raising children mating strategies. When women engage in short-term mating strategies, they demand that the man has excellent genetics. He has to be the best-looking guy in the room, the strongest guy in the room, the most successful man in the room. When men engage in, by the way, of course, I'm not encouraging short-term mating strategies. I've been with one person my entire life. We just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary, and I was a virgin when I got married. And so, I'm 100% in favor of celibacy and monogamy as a religious observance. It's very important for successful society. But anyway, when men engage in short-term mating, their criteria and their demands of what the women are like plummet, and they become dogged and dog-like and undiscerning. So there are huge differences behaviorally, physically, mentally. Even when they got 80 diseases they studied men versus women on, and there's a marked difference in 70 of them where you're either going to be way more likely to get it as a woman, way more likely to get it as a man. 70 of the 80 diseases that we have hard evidence for, of if they tend to prefer one sex over the other. And so, to make the list, there might be 100 studies, there might be 1,000, but there had to be at least 10, and they all show the same thing, and there could not be a single study in existence in the world that went against that. And they still came up with a list. So I don't think there's anything wrong with when we see universal differences within, and this, honestly, it's not even within humans. You'd be able to find these differences within almost all forms of life. There are exceptions sometimes, but within almost all forms of life. And so if you find these differences, then it would make sense that our Creator would also possess those features as well, and that would be a part of the Creator's reality. And so we ascribe both masculine and feminine qualities to the Creator, but we don't try to neuter them and say there's no qualities, because there's a beautiful thing it is to be a woman. There's a beautiful thing it is to be a man. If you're a woman, you can carry a child, and you can also lactate. That's a special thing. It creates a special bond. Children can smell their mother's breast milk. If you've ever been to the birth of your child, who's been to the birth of a child, whether it's yours or, it's unbelievable how children naturally latch onto the breast. It's just unbelievable. The bond between the mother and child. They've studied, and children will begin to mimic the sound of their mother's voice, the accent. They study German versus French accents because they have such a remarkable difference in the cadence of the voice. And children began to mirror, in their crying, the accent of their parent within 2 weeks of being born. It's incredible, the bond between mothers and their children. And why should we downplay that? Why should we discredit women for carrying children? Why should we discredit women for lactating? The incredible austerity. They grow another organ. The placenta is an additional organ that a woman grows inside her body. It's huge. Have you ever seen a placenta? It's a massive organ. It's like this big. It's a huge organ that a woman creates in her body to facilitate the interchange of nutrients between her body and the child's body. When women give birth, they give birth to the child, and then afterwards, a few minutes later, they give birth to the placenta. And it's like she was carrying twins. It's not a small organ, it's a large organ. We shouldn't dismiss the specialness of this. And we also shouldn't dismiss the specialness that men have. And the primary one is that men are protectors. I can finish with an anecdote. I remember being 7 years old, and my grandfather and grandmother owned a department store in downtown Santa Monica. And you'd think if your grandparents owned a department store, I'd pretty much just be able to go there whenever I wanted to, and I would be loaded with all the latest gear. It wasn't like that. I went to get together one time a year and pick out like one thing. So anyway, I went and got an OP, Ocean Pacific, jacket. It was two-tone, and it had that kind of like the corduroy, almost like with a cowboy design on the top, tan, and the jacket itself was brown. And this was 1979, so it was like that. And I was wearing OP shorts and hang ten socks and Vans and the whole deal. And we went and picked up that jacket, and we were on our way back home, and a homeless guy accosted my mother and myself in the car when we were driving. So we pulled up at a light on Santa Monica Boulevard, and he was walking across the street. My mom accidentally veered into the pedestrian walking a little bit. So he was forced to, when he walked across the street, walk around the car. You know how you do that? I mean, it's so common that when they have the sensors for the weight of your car to know that the light they don't put the sensors behind the line. They put the sensors in front of the line because everybody goes over the line. Anyway, so he had to walk around, and he was angry, and he started slamming on the hood of my mom's car. He started slamming on the hood of my mom's car and screaming at her. And when you're a kid and you're growing up, you always think your parents will protect you from any harm. I thought my mom was like a giantess and she would protect me from anything and everything. And I had no fear when I was with her. But in that moment, when an aggressive male confronted my mom, she locked the doors, rolled the windows up, and I saw her face and she froze. And I was traumatized by it. Enough so that, 43 years later, I can still remember it. 44 years later almost, I can still remember it. My dad, that never happened with. My dad wasn't a particularly large male, but there's just no question. If anybody had ever threatened us like that happened, my dad would have been out of the car in a second. Whether he won or lost is a whole other subject. But, that's another roll of the dice. But there's just no question. Now, there may be effeminate men and masculinized women, but you should describe them as such, because these qualities are masculine and feminine. Empathy, nurturing, as exemplified by lactation on one side, and violence as protection as expressed as violence, or the capacity for violence on the other side. And so there is something beautiful about meditating on Krishna as being your father as well as being your mother. Because it creates a feeling that you will be nurtured and you'll be protected. And these are important feelings for a devotee dedicating their life to spirituality, to divinity, to be able to feel in relationship to the deity. We should feel protected by the deity. We should feel nurtured by the deity. These are important sentiments to cultivate. And in fact, by envisioning Krishna as being both masculine and feminine, you're aided in this. You can better do this. By conceiving of Krishna as both your mother and your father, as opposed to a neutered deity. By conceiving Krishna as, the perfection of a father, the perfection of a mother. You're actually aided in cultivating these feelings towards divinity. We should not shy away from looking at the sex differences. What we should shy away from and get over is trying to make a distinction where one is superior than the other. That's problematic. That needs to be transcended. But to celebrate the differences and to actually apply both of them to Krishna is progressive. It's in concordance with reality. This is reality. To deny this is to deny reality. To then view the world in these terms is to view the world in accord with the actual reality of the situation. And we'll finish class with this. 800 years ago, in the 12th century, 900 years ago, in the 12th century, there was a pundit. His name was Arjuna Acharya. And he was from Odisha, which is a seaside state on the eastern seaboard of India. Very poor rural state. Very poor rural state. Super pious. Where Jagannath Puri is. Where Jagannath comes from. And so this Arjuna Acharya was commentating on the Gita. He was writing a commentary, which is traditional to do. He was writing it on a palm leaf. You scratch and do it with a stick. And then later you fill in with a graphite. You rub that over, and then it goes into the grooves. It's actually better than writing something with a pen, which could eventually be wiped off, because the grooves are actually made into parchment. So if you lose the graphite or whatever it is, the material you're using to fill in the grooves, you can always just rub more, and then the words will reappear again. So he was writing a commentary, and he was commentating on this verse. And the verse says, Yogakshemam vahami aham. Vahami is in the first person, present tense. I carry. It literally means I carry. It's a verb. I carry. First person, present tense, singular, of the verb to carry. Vahami. And he thought, Krishna is God. He is not personally carrying you what you lack. He's not personally preserving what you have. Rather, by God's omnipotence, he is facilitating it as an omnipotent being. So he thought this vahami is not the right word. So he actually changed the Gita. He crossed out the word vahami and he wrote koromyaham. Karomi means I make it happen. That's where you get the word karma from. The Cree root to do. So namaskar comes from the same root. Karma comes from the same root. And so, karomyaham, I make it happen. I do it. Which could mean I do it through my ambassadors. I do it through my emissaries. I do it through material nature. I'm ultimately at the top, but I'm getting it done. Not that I'm personally arranging for what you lack and what you have and preserving one and bringing the other. Not like that. So he did that. And then he finished writing and he went to take his bath. And this was a traditional patriarchal society. 12th century India was that. So anyway, his wife stayed home and cooked, and then he went, took bath. And Brahmins traditionally bathe 3 times a day before each meal. So you'll get dirty, you'll do stuff, but then before you take your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, before that time, you will take bath, get fully clean, put on fresh cloth, chant your Gayatri, and then only then will you eat. People generally don't do this now, but it's quite common in India, especially in a rural situation. I take bath 3 times a day. Anyway, so this is very, very traditional Brahminical culture. You take bath 3 times a day, you put on fresh cloth, you chant your Gayatri, and then you eat. So he finished his sadhana for the morning of writing, and then he went to go take bath, and he was going to come home and have lunch. His wife was cooking. When he got home, his wife had already eaten, and no meal was served. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but in traditional patriarchal Indian society, the woman never ate before the husband. She'd serve the husband first and eat afterwards. It's like an unstated rule. It's not like in a scripture or anything like that, but it was the cultural norm. Your mom must have followed this, right? They're South Indian Brahmins. Their family would have followed this. So my wife followed this for years until we had kids. And then she started saying, no, the kids. And I'm still like a little twisted up about it. But at least for 5 years, my wife would never dream of eating before me. I never even asked. Her own thing. She learned it from her mom or whatever. But then once we had kids, it started, she's pregnant and she needs nutrition. She's hypoglycemic. So I couldn't be a total, misogynistic jerk. And so I had to get over myself. But anyway, he came home and his wife had eaten, which was the first time in their entire relationship that had happened. And he said, Davy, it's a respectful way of speaking to your wife, Davy, why have you eaten? Where's my lunch? And she said, I'm not going to serve you. You can go and get yourself if you want. I don't want to look at your face. And he was confused. They didn't fight. He didn't get angry. He was a sadhu. He never got angry. And he said, what have I done? Why are you treating me this way? She said, you're such a cruel person. You're such a cruel man. I don't have anything to do with you. And he said, I'm vexed. I have no idea what you're talking about. And she said, you beat those boys mercilessly. And he said, what boys? And she said, when you left, just a few minutes after you left, 2 boys showed up at our house. And they were bloody. And they had whip marks on their back where they'd been beaten by you, by your cane. And they brought us all this food. And she pointed, and there was all sorts of vegetables and fruits and grains and ghee and oil. And so many things were there. Nuts. Everything was there. And she said, they brought all this. You made them carry, all of those small boys had to carry this heavy load. And they were so afraid, and they showed me their back, and I saw where you had cruelly cut into their back with your cane. And Arjuna he was a pundit. He was learned. So he said, what did the boys look like? And she said, They were so beautiful. One of them was dark, like a cloud, like a rain cloud. He was wearing a yellow dhoti. The other one was white, like the moon. He was wearing a blue dhoti. And Arjuna could understand that Krishna and Balaram had visited his home. And they visited his home, and he immediately stopped what he was doing. And he ran back to the parchment where he crossed out the word Vahami, I carry personally. And he'd written Karomi, I make it happen. And he changed it back to Vahami. Because the Lord had come to his home. Hurt by his crossing it out, and the crossing out of the Gita became the marks on the child's back. And Krishna came there and brought things to prove now the Lord himself will personally carry you, will personally help you. A great king may have so many ministers to teach their child, but they will personally teach their child how to walk, how to read. Not because they have no one that can do it, but because they're so powerful, they can personally do it themselves. And why would they let anybody else do it? Out of love, they're going to do it personally. And so, these words, for millennia, for thousands of years, these words have touched the hearts of devotees who have full faith and experience that Krishna carries them through life. That they stand in the palm of God's hand. That Krishna is always protecting them. Always looking after them. Such that they don't fear anymore. And they're peaceful. In a way that no one else can be peaceful. Without such a revelation that there's an all-good, all-powerful deity personally caring for you, how can you live in this world free from fear? This world's terrifying. Accidents, disease. I was just counseling my friend. Their 24-year-old son got in a motorcycle accident and died. They got married around the same time we got married. We had kids around the same time. This world is a slaughterhouse. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. When will disease, death, loss, reversal, betrayal, pain, and suffering assail you next? We're so small. We're so weak. Car come out of nowhere and just ruin your life. Break you in half. This stuff happens. You go on the freeway, look at the center divider on the freeway sometime. Look at the center divider on the freeway. Don't you see if you look at the center divider on the freeway? Huh? You see skid mark after skid mark after skid mark. If you drive from here to LAX, you will see skid marks every 15 or so feet on the freeway. You know why that is? Because there's been that many accidents since they built the freeway, where it's practically one long skid mark along the center divider. A verse like this, for a devotee who's experimented with this verse, who's turned towards Krishna, who's cried out to Krishna, and Krishna's been there for them, this verse is as dear to us as our life. We stake our life on this verse. This verse is our anchor. It gives us strength. It gives us comfort. Krishna is your mother. Krishna is your father. Is always there, protecting you and nurturing you, caring for you. Peace comes from this verse. You can't just read it, though, and get to peace. You have to read it, you have to practice it, you read it and you practice it, and then Krishna reciprocates with you and you can see it. And your life's never the same. Eventually this becomes the least doubtable thing in the world. Eventually this becomes the least doubtable thing in the world. It becomes a thing you're most sure of in the whole universe. For those who always worship me with exclusive devotion, meditating on me, to them I carry what they lack and I preserve what they have. Thank you very much. Let's do a little kirtan. Hare Krishna.